What kind of man kills the woman he claims to love just because she laughed? What kind of ruler turns his most intimate insecurities into a death sentence? This is the story of a powerful emperor, feared by his enemies and adored by his courtiers, but also absolutely paranoid, obsessed with his image, and cruel beyond redemption. His name was Elagabalus, and although few remember him today, his reign in Rome was an orgy of excess, public humiliations, arbitrary murders, and a sexuality as free as it was violent. This emperor not only violated all the social and religious norms of the Roman Empire, he turned power into a depraved spectacle, and his palace into a deadly trap for anyone who didn't worship him or dared to laugh. His most infamous crime, the murder of his own wife for laughing at his penis, was not an isolated act, but rather a brutal reflection of his character. The truth is that Elagabalus, elevated to the throne as a teenager, seemed far more interested in sexual games, obscene rituals, and humiliating senators than in governing an empire. But how did a young Syrian man, dressed as a woman and obsessed with the god Sol, come to occupy the most powerful throne in the world? To understand this, we must go back to a turbulent era. Rome was fractured, power was fought over between dynasties, and blood was common currency on the path to power. In the midst of this storm, an ambitious woman, Julia Maesa, decided her grandson should be emperor. It didn't matter that he knew nothing of politics or that he was a teenage priest dressed in golden tunics. One thing mattered above all: control. Elagabalus was born as Varius Avitus Bassianus in 204 AD in Emesa, a city in the Roman province of Syria. From childhood, he was consecrated as high priest of the eastern sun god Elagabalus, whose devotion involved intense rituals, blood, and a fusion of religion and sexuality that would scandalize even the most open-minded Romans. His childhood was marked by the chants of temple virgins, ritual banquets, sacrifices, and above all, one idea: he was not simply human, he was a divine envoy. But this young man's destiny was not to remain in Syria. In Rome, the throne was up for grabs. Emperor Caracalla had been assassinated, and his successor, Macrinus, was unpopular and weak. Julia Maesa, Elagabalus's grandmother and sister of the powerful Julia Domna, wife of Emperor Septimius Severus, saw clearly: if she could convince the army that her grandson was Caracalla's illegitimate son, they could overthrow the usurper and restore their dynasty. Thus began one of the boldest propaganda campaigns in the Roman world. In just a few months, with money from Syria and his grandmother's political skill, Elagabalus was proclaimed emperor by the legions of the East. He was only 14 years old. No one yet realized that this teenage emperor was ready to burn everything in his path, and he would do it with a smile painted in carmine, surrounded by eunuchs, prostitutes, and a harem of male lovers. For Elagabalus, power was not a duty, it was a pleasure. And so began his arrival in Rome, triumphal, dressed as an Eastern goddess with makeup, incense, and religious chants that enraged the senators and scandalized Jupiter's priests. Rome was unprepared for what was coming and never fully recovered. But before delving into his reign, the banquets of human flesh, the death wheels spun by slaves, and the public weddings with gladiators, it is important to understand how this Syrian teenager became the most powerful man in the world. The year was 218 AD. The Roman Empire, though still vast, was fragmented by internal struggles, coups, and the weakening of central authority. After the assassination of Emperor Caracalla by his praetorian prefect Macrinus, a political storm erupted. Macrinus declared himself emperor, but his equestrian, non-senatorial mining origin made him unpopular among Rome's elites. Furthermore, he had no blood ties to the Severan dynasty, making him an easy target for any powerful family wishing to restore order, or rather, its own lineage. Julia Maesa, aunt of the late Caracalla and matriarch of one of Syria's most influential families, saw Macrinus's weakness as a golden opportunity. Her grandson, Varius Avitus Bassianus, the future Elagabalus, was young, manipulable, and most importantly, could be presented as the illegitimate son of the charismatic and now deified Caracalla. It was a lie, of course, but a lie attractive enough for the Eastern legions, who still worshipped Caracalla as a semi-divine warrior. With a plan as simple as it was risky, Julia Maesa began spreading the false genealogy, that her grandson was not just a priest of the sun god, but the true heir to the throne. Supported by her family's wealth and deep knowledge of Roman politics, she financed bribes, organized internal revolts, and mobilized troops loyal to the deceased emperor. The legions stationed in Emesa and other parts of Syria, discontented with Macrinus's regime, quickly rallied to her cause. Thus, in May 218, Elagabalus was proclaimed emperor by the eastern troops. He was only 14 years old, his face painted with temple pigments, and far more devoted to his solar deity than to Rome itself. To many, it was a moment of dynastic restoration. To others, a blasphemy disguised as revolution. Macrinus reacted forcefully, but his army was defeated at the Battle of Antioch. In desperation, he tried to flee disguised as a messenger, but was captured and executed alongside his young son, Diadumenian. So fell the emperor who had tried to rule through discipline and reason, replaced by a youth who considered it more important to change the Roman calendar to honor his foreign god than to attend to the Senate or border wars. The Senate, cornered by circumstances, accepted Elagabalus as the new emperor. They had no alternative. What they didn't know was that this young man was about to blow apart all of Rome's sacred structures. From his arrival, he changed the way religion, gender, politics, and fear were understood. Because the young emperor had no intention of following the rules of his predecessors. He didn't want to be Caesar. He wanted to be a living embodiment of his god, El-Gabal, fusing his body with the divine and his government with the rituals he had practiced since childhood. One of his first decisions was to build a monumental temple in the heart of Rome, the Elagabalium, to impose the Syrian solar cult as the official religion of the empire. There he moved sacred relics, including a black stone, possibly a meteorite, representing the god El-Gabal. This decision enraged the deeply devout Roman populace and scandalized the Senate. But Elagabalus didn't stop there. Within months of arriving in Rome, he publicly married a Vestal virgin, a union forbidden and punishable by death, and later held an even more provocative ceremony, a wedding between himself and a gladiator, where Elagabalus took the role of the bride. But what was most striking were not his sexual preferences, but his desire to theatricalize everything, to mock established power. For him, the empire was a stage, and he was its absolute protagonist. Tensions grew. The Senate began fearing not only for the stability of the empire, but for its very survival. Any opposition was punished with summary executions or exile. But what was most unsettling was that blood flowed not only due to political conspiracies, but personal whims. It was in this context of chaos that one of the most infamous episodes of his reign occurred. The murder of his wife Annia Faustina, who had the audacity to laugh during one of his private nights after seeing, according to chronicles, his penis and making a mocking comment. That laughter was enough to seal her fate. The empress was publicly executed the next day. But this murder, far from being an isolated case, was merely a glimpse of the kind of violence with which Elagabalus ruled. Emotional, immediate, savage. Because when you govern from ego and not reason, every offense becomes treason, and every treason, a death sentence. And the worst was yet to come. From the moment Elagabalus set foot in Rome, the capital felt something profound had changed. and not for the better. It was as if a foreign force, alien to the Roman soul, had taken the throne. Traditional temples were relegated. Religious ceremonies were replaced by Syrian rituals filled with blood, exotic incense, animal sacrifices, and sometimes even human ones. But if the religious scandal was already unbearable for the Senate, Elagabalus's court was pure hell wrapped in purple silk. The chroniclers of the time, such as Dio Cassius and Herodian, although not always impartial, agree in describing a reign filled with sadism, humiliation, and unrestrained sexuality. The emperor, now invested as high priest of the god Elagabal, saw himself as more than human, as a divine being who should not be subject to earthly laws. This belief led him to commit acts of brutality that were as absurd as they were repulsive. One of Elagabalus's favorite games was to invite members of the Senate to dinner, make them drink until delirious, and then order them locked into secret rooms with no exit. When they awoke, they found themselves surrounded by wild beasts, tamed lions or leopards that sniffed and growled at them, though without attacking. The purpose was to sow absolute terror. Then, the next day when the doors were opened, Elagabalus would laugh from above, celebrating the anguish he had caused. However, these were merely entertainments. The real horrors came when someone challenged him, or simply bored him. One of the most macabre customs of his court was staging public executions disguised as theatrical spectacles. On one occasion, he organized a fake wedding in the Roman circus, and at the moment of "I do," ordered the supposed groom to be beheaded, throwing his head into the audience as if it were part of a bloody comedy. But the victims were not only political enemies. Many times, they were his lovers, or those who had been close to him. His relationships with men were riddled with jealousy, manipulation, and violence. One of his favorites, a gladiator named Heracles, was elevated to the rank of imperial husband. Elagabalus demanded to be called Empress and referred to himself as the wife of the strongest among men. Yet when Heracles showed interest in another servant, Elagabalus had him publicly castrated, accusing him of adultery with a coldness that chilled everyone present. Another infamous practice was selecting men based on the shape of their bodies, making them undress before him, and deciding whether they were worthy of being touched by the Son incarnate. Those who refused were beaten to death or thrown into the Tiber. His palace was full of ornamental slaves, made up and dressed in women's clothes, whom he forced to serve him like sacred concubines. Perhaps one of the most chilling anecdotes, repeated in various sources, was his obsession with genital surgery. According to accounts, Elagabalus offered large sums of money to any physician who could turn him into a woman through an operation. Although the medicine of the time couldn't fulfill such a request, some tried to appease him with primitive and painful techniques. These experiments on his body and others were not just a cry for identity. They were also ritual acts, staged before courtiers forced to applaud, while blood was spilled in the name of the divine. And the most sinister part, Elagabalus organized banquets where, instead of regular dishes, parts of executed enemies' human bodies were served. It is believed this was not a widespread practice but selective, an act reserved to symbolically punish anyone daring enough to offend the god emperor. In one of these banquets, it is even claimed that one of the guests was forced to eat the heart of his own son, after having been deceived by Elagabalus into believing it was an exotic delicacy from Asia. The imperial palace, once a symbol of power and reason, had become a circus of perversions, where the line between human and monstrous blurred. No one was safe. Not the nobility, not the army, not the people, not even his own family. And so we arrive at one of the most disturbing scenes: the murder of his adoptive mother, Cornelia Paula, whom he accused of conspiring against him simply because she warned him about the danger of alienating the army. He ordered her execution without trial. The next day, he commanded his servants to hang her head in the temple of Elagabal as a warning. If the orgies, public executions, and private tortures weren't enough proof of Elagabalus's darkness, what he did with religion and Rome's spiritual soul is unprecedented. The emperor not only proclaimed himself high priest of the Syrian sun god Elagabal, he imposed him by blood and fire over all the gods of the Roman pantheon. What were once millennia-old customs, respected even by sadistic emperors like Caligula or Nero, were abolished without hesitation. Elagabalus didn't want coexistence, he wanted eradication. The great religious offensive began with the imperial order to move the sacred black stone from the temple of Elagabal, brought from Emesa, to the very heart of the empire, the Palatine Hill. There he ordered the construction of a huge golden dome-shaped sanctuary. Every day, thousands of citizens were forced to witness rituals in which animals were sacrificed en masse, and according to unconfirmed but repeated testimonies, also human beings, especially slaves or political prisoners. Elagabalus wore golden tunics, Syrian jewels, and a pointed crown that made him look more like a deity from the east than a Roman emperor. In the most sacred rituals, according to Herodian's own chronicles, he did not allow the presence of women unless they were eunuchs or disguised as castrated priests. In these ceremonies, he danced until falling into a trance, while the temple floor was stained with blood. Roman augurs, guardians of traditional religious order, protested. Elagabalus responded by ordering their execution. Several of them had their eyes gouged out, accused of having looked improperly at the divine sun without being worthy. The head of the Vestals, the sacred order of virgins who guarded Rome's eternal flame, was beheaded, and his ashes were thrown into the sea, interpreted as an ominous omen. The fire of Rome was being extinguished, symbolically and literally. Religious perversion reached its climax when the emperor decreed that all Roman gods must submit to Elagabal. To stage this submission, he organized a ritual in which statues of Jupiter, Mars, Venus, and Minerva were carried in procession to the solar temple and placed on their knees before the Syrian black stone. The gesture was seen as a national humiliation. It was as if Rome's very soul were being crucified on its own capital. But the most macabre part wasn't that. It was the mystical wedding between Elagabal and Minerva. Elagabalus, self-proclaimed high priest and earthly incarnation of the sun god, ordered a wedding ceremony between himself, representing his deity, and the statue of Minerva, protector of Rome. This farce was celebrated with a night procession where citizens were forced to throw petals, sing hymns, and applaud as orgies and sacrifices unfolded in the streets. Those who refused to participate were branded with a hot iron on the forehead. The symbol was a circle pierced by a lightning bolt, the seal of the sun. Some tried to flee Rome, but Elagabalus ordered borders reinforced and fugitives arrested without permission. The escapees were chained and displayed as traitors to the god. Many were thrown unarmed into the Colosseum before hungry beasts, while the nobility, forced to witness the punishment, had to applaud or risk the same fate. The emperor, driven mad by spiritual megalomania, did not stop. At one point, he summoned the most important astrologers and prophets of the empire. He ordered them to write a new prophecy, proclaiming Elagabal as the true creator of the world and Elagabalus as his son. One of the sages refused. Elagabalus forced him to eat his own parchment, had him hung upside down on a cross, and burned alive while reciting psalms in Syriac. It was then that the Roman people, disgusted, began secretly speaking of curses, apocalyptic omens, and an end of the world not symbolic, but real. The emperor also began experimenting with necromancy. According to some testimonies, he held nocturnal conversations with corpses. He ordered the bodies of fallen soldiers or executed nobles to be exhumed, placed in chairs within the temple of Elagabal, fitted with golden masks, and spoke to them for hours. He claimed they answered. He said they confirmed his power. Some historians believe these rituals sought to imitate certain ancient Mesopotamian cults, albeit distorted beyond recognition. And while the Senate trembled and the army contained its disdain, the people could only watch in silence as their empire crumbled under the shadow of an emperor who was no longer a man, but a nightmare wrapped in gold, blood, and mystical madness. But the third and final stage of his atrocities, the one that would mark his end, was yet to come. Because the same Elagabalus who believed himself immortal committed an irreparable mistake, mocking military power and touching something that not even the Roman gods dared provoke, the honor of the army. And that mistake, as we will see on the following page, was his death sentence. Until this point, the Roman people could endure. Keep silent, pretend, even tolerate their emperor killing senators, desecrating temples, and celebrating orgies with blood and fire. But there was one line no emperor should ever cross, insulting the army that kept him in power. And Elagabalus, with his excessive arrogance, not only crossed that line, he shattered it into pieces. The confrontation with the Praetorians, the elite imperial guard, began as a whisper, a suspicion of mistreatment. But soon it became a cry of outrage. The emperor had started replacing hardened veteran soldiers with eunuchs brought from Syria. He publicly degraded the men who had fought for Rome, calling them filthy beasts and mocking their appearance. One soldier, according to historian Cassius Dio, was forced to parade naked before the Senate while they threw rotten fruit at him, simply for addressing Elagabalus without permission. But that was not the worst. Elagabalus, obsessed with absolute control, began to toy with the honor of tribunes and officers. He summoned several to dinners in the temple of Elagabal, and after getting them drunk, made them participate in humiliating rituals. One was forced to dress as a prostitute and dance for his courtiers while being whipped. Another was compelled to marry a eunuch in a public ceremony, complete with every mockery the emperor could muster. Flower crowns, burlesque music, coins thrown by prostitutes, and sarcastic speeches about the new imperial order. The tension exploded when Elagabalus ordered the execution of the commander of the Praetorian Guard. His crime: failing to send him a new lover from Egypt. The commander was beheaded during a public audience, and his head was placed on a silver platter at the imperial banquet table. The emperor ate olives and dates beside it, as if it were just another decoration. This execution was the breaking point. The army, humiliated and outraged, began to conspire. But Elagabalus didn't notice. He was too busy organizing what would become his most grotesque act: a human sacrifice using Roman officers as victims. In an attempt to purify the masculine energy of the empire, the emperor ordered the kidnapping of 3 high-ranking centurions. For 3 days, he kept them locked in the temple, dressed in golden tunics and laurel crowns. Each night he gave them wine mixed with opium, spoke to them of their divine fate, and finally, sacrificed them one by one, slitting their throats with a ceremonial knife while dancing around them naked and covered in blood. News of this crime spread like wildfire among the soldiers, and when Elagabalus, without a trace of remorse, appeared at the Colosseum for a public celebration, he committed the greatest mistake of his life. He mocked the size of a decurion's penis in front of thousands of people. From his private box, he shouted, "Is that the soldier protecting Rome? Even my wives have more manhood than him." The crowd fell silent. The decurion, face red with fury, did not respond, but the Praetorians did. That same night, as Elagabalus returned to the palace with his mother, Julia Soemius, a group of officers entered through secret corridors of the imperial complex. They were armed, determined, and silent. The emperor thought it was a courtesy visit. He ordered wine and music to be prepared. But when he saw them appear with swords drawn, he realized, far too late, that his games were over. He tried to flee. It is said he hid inside a chest in the temple of Vesta together with his mother. He screamed, cried, promised to abdicate, begged for his life. But there was no mercy. The soldiers dragged him through the palace halls while he shrieked like a child. "I am the son of the sun. You cannot kill me," he repeated. They stabbed him more than 20 times. His mother, who tried to shield him with her body, was beheaded, and her head was thrown out a window. Both bodies were dragged through the streets of Rome, stripped of all dignity. Soldiers kicked them, spat on them, and threw them into the Tiber River. But before that, the people had their final word. They cut off Elagabalus's penis and impaled it on a spear, as a symbol of all the horror, scandal, and humiliation his reign represented. The emperor who turned his body into a spectacle, his palace into a brothel, and his empire into a bloody farce, had fallen. And the echo of his atrocities still resonated in the stones of Rome. But his fall would not erase the damage. The political, religious, and social consequences of his rule would be felt for decades, because the empire inherited by his successors was no longer the same. The death of Elagabalus was not the end of his story, but the beginning of its aftermath. His reign, though brief, only 4 years, left deep scars on the Roman Empire. Never before had an emperor degraded the dignity of the throne so thoroughly, and the wounds he caused did not heal easily. First, imperial authority was weakened. Senators, humiliated and persecuted during his rule, began to see the throne as a game of appearances rather than real power. Many stopped believing in the seriousness of central government and began forming regional alliances, which later contributed to the fragmentation of the empire. Second, his obsessive imposition of the cult of Elagabal, the Syrian sun god, created a religious fracture. Rome, already a mosaic of beliefs, entered open conflict between defenders of the old Roman deities and those who feared the expansion of foreign cults. This conflict planted seeds of intolerance and censorship that would later erupt violently. Militarily, the army no longer trusted emperors. Elagabalus's episode taught soldiers that they could make and unmake a Caesar when they deemed him unworthy. This mindset ushered in the so-called crisis of the 3rd century, during which dozens of emperors would be assassinated by their own troops. The stability of the empire was completely shaken. But perhaps the most lasting impact was on collective memory. Elagabalus became synonymous with perversion, chaos, and degeneration. His name was erased from inscriptions, his portraits destroyed, his history removed from official documents. He became a victim of damnatio memoriae, a Roman condemnation meant to erase all traces of his existence. And yet, they failed. Because centuries later, his figure still provokes horror, fascination, and debate. He was an emperor who took narcissism, eroticism, and violence to levels never seen before. His downfall did not just mark the end of a reign, but the beginning of an era of distrust, decadence, and fragmentation for Rome. The most powerful throne in the world had been used as the stage for a bloody delirium. And Rome, although it survived, was never quite the same again. But how do we remember someone whose very existence was meant to be erased? Elagabalus was more than an eccentric emperor. He was the extreme reflection of unchecked power, of youth corrupted by the cult of pleasure and worship of the self. His throne, which should have been a symbol of stability, became a stage for excess and horror. They tried to erase him, tried to forget him. But his grotesque and fascinating story lives on because it confronts us with an uncomfortable question. What happens when someone is given everything, without restraint, without law, without conscience. Elagabalus did not fall merely for mocking a soldier's penis, nor for killing his wife for laughing at his own. He fell because he defied all the pillars that upheld Rome: tradition, honor, religion, and military discipline. And when those pillars break, no empire can endure. Today, more than 1800 years later, his name still burns as a warning. Because absolute power, without soul or sanity, does not breed glory. It breeds ruin. And you, who have read this far, do you think he was simply a madman with a crown? Or the face of something far deeper and more dangerous that could happen again? Leave your thoughts in the comments.